let's look at the role of hemoglobin and what it binds during transport of gases. So in the alveolus, here's the alveolus, the oxygen leaves the alveolus, and in the capillary, here's your oxygen, the hemoglobin is waiting and to pick up the oxygen, and you get oxyhemoglobin, which is red. Now this oxyhemoglobin travels to, in the bloodstream, it travels to the body cells. In the body cell, the hemoglobin releases the oxygen, so it becomes blue again, and the oxygen is released into the body cell. So there's your oxygen going into the body cell to help with cellular respiration. In the body cell, the carbon dioxide that's released from the cellular respiration comes out of the body cell, and it combines with hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin becomes carbaminohemoglobin. So hemoglobin has the ability to bind both oxygen and carbon dioxide. It only binds with carbon dioxide after it has dropped off the oxygen. There is a third molecule that binds to hemoglobin, and that molecule is a dangerous one. It is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is not normally found in blood, but when it is found in blood, it has a very, very, very strong affinity to hemoglobin, to the point that hemoglobin cannot bind to oxygen, which is supposed to normally. This is oxygen. Hemoglobin normally binds to oxygen. Hemoglobin normally binds to carbon dioxide, but it has the highest affinity for carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide binds 200 times more tightly to hemoglobin than oxygen. As a result, you can die of carbon monoxide poisoning, which is why we have those carbon monoxide sensors in our apartments, because if carbon monoxide finds hemoglobin, there is no hope. Oxygen can no longer bind to hemoglobin and death can result. We know that oxygen binds to hemoglobin. However, what prompts the hemoglobin to release the oxygen? So this would depend upon whether or not a tissue is active. An active tissue clearly demands more oxygen, so the hemoglobin will release the oxygen there. Now, in order to understand how that happens and in what situations it happens, we need to look at these percent oxygen saturation of hemoglobin graphs. And to do that, we need to understand some basic facts. So let's go over those first. Number 1, a hemoglobin molecule can hold up to 4 oxygen atoms. If all 4 positions are occupied by oxygen, then the hemoglobin is said to be saturated. Let's look at this graph. Here, the line corresponds to where the saturation curves. The line corresponds to about 75%. So we can safely say that the hemoglobin is 75% saturated. This means 3 out of 4 of the positions in hemoglobin are occupied with oxygen. So the hemoglobin is holding on to 3 of the oxygens. So let's look at the next 2 rules that we need to know. And that has to do with the position of these curves. Now look at the normal here. This is the normal body temperature, and this is the blue line that you see here is the normal. That is your 75% saturation that we just talked about. If there is a curve that is to the right of the normal, so this is right of the normal, then this means that oxygen is being released. Means the hemoglobin is giving up the oxygen. If there are any lines that are to the left of the normal, this means that oxygen is being held by the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is holding on to the oxygen. This is how hemoglobin decides whether or not to give up the oxygen. So, when you look at this at 43 degrees Celsius, the temperature of a tissue which is very high clearly means that the tissue is metabolically active. So, the hemoglobin decides to give up the oxygen. So, any curve to the right means giving up the oxygen. Any curve to the left means holding on to the oxygen. So clearly a tissue that's cold, 10 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, is much lower than body temperature. The hemoglobin decides to hold on to the oxygen and says, well, you're not doing anything. You don't need any oxygen. So the hemoglobin holds on to the oxygen. Let's interpret the oxygen dissociation curves for pH. Let's look at the normal pH first. Here we have the normal pH, and like we said earlier, anything to the right means that the oxygen is being released. So just by going with our rules, we'll say oxygen is being released or dissociated. Oxygen is dissociated. And anything to the left means oxygen is being held. Now, let's see if that makes sense from a physiological point of view. Why is it that pH 7.2 is on the right side? It's on the right side because any tissue that's active tends to have a lower pH than normal. So an active tissue will have a low pH. So pH is very low when a tissue is active. When a tissue is passive, not working very hard, is sort of an inactive tissue. When you have an inactive tissue, then the pH tends to be high.